The coal mine drainage is a challenge because so many of the operations that created the problem have gone bankrupt and aren't there anymore to deal with it. And they've generated a pollutant source that could last for thousands of years.
When we come across some of the phenomena we find on the planet, sometimes we tend to take such wonders of nature for granted. The cat napping on the fence, the trees giving it shade, and the rich soil giving that sprawling tree the nourishment it needs to be so tall. As such, I.T. should come as no surprise that most residents of the U.S. walked past this supposedly polluted creek without thinking much about it. Who would? After all, the orange water and the sour metallic smell was not much to write home about.
Now, you've probably heard people talking recently about rare earth elements, but you might be wondering to yourself, well, what are they? How much of a big deal are they? And should we be worried about them?
However, a group of scientists decided to take a dive into such water, and lo and behold, they found that there was much to these waters than meets the eye. So much so that it could change the shape of global politics for years to come. Join us as we take a look at how some toxic sludge became one of the most valuable discoveries in the U.S., the Orange Creek. Our story begins 20 years ago. The site of this journey, Deckers Creek, West Virginia. Back then, it looked like a dead spot. After all, the water had an orange tinge, and the rocks found there were stained red and brown, as though it was covered in rust. As you can imagine, this was a no-go area to the locals. Not only did the adults decide that this was no place to go fishing, the children were warned to stay clear of it. It was so bad that even insects that have a tendency to linger around stagnant water decided that this was not the place for them.
Wants to swim in a creek that's bright orange, and who wants to fish in a creek where you're not going to catch fish.
Looking deeper into this dying creek, an investigation will lead to the discovery of the fact that abandoned coal mines filled with fractured stone and a mineral referred to as pyrite lay deep within the hills nearby. Also referred to as fool's gold, this pyrite seemed to react to rainwater in a way that released acids that carved metals out of the rocks. As a result, we got what is referred to as acid mine drainage. This phenomenon seemed so corrosive that it ate through pipes with ease. In time, it gave us the lifeless Decker Creek that you couldn't even swim in. As you can imagine, this place was a no-go for quite some time. Despite this, some scientists decided to look into the events that occurred there. That is when they realized that the metal being washed from the rocks weren't just iron and aluminum. It also proved to be far more valuable than they ever imagined.
And then ideally, if there is assistance that we can provide with helping in a Growing Greener grant for remediating some of these sources, that's what we want to do in the future.
We're talking about the same rare earth elements that were used in fighter jets, smartphones, electric cars, and the likes. To make things even better, the mud forming around the creek carried what could be considered to be toxic levels of these rare earth metals, so much so that you could compare the content to what could be found in some mines in many parts of the world. As you can imagine, the prospects were quite exciting, especially when you consider how much of the elements the U.S. could harvest from this condemned creek. The accidental chemical reaction. Over in the Appalachia, many found that mines that were abandoned long ago suddenly became active laboratories. This is due to the acidic waters that basically dissolve metals into liquid form. This was interesting, especially as traditional mining would need basic crushing plants to achieve the same effect. After some processing, the dissolved metals eventually fell into the water.
The pyrite or the iron sulfide minerals that are associated with the coal get oxidized to form sulfuric acid, and that sulfuric acid dissolves rocks around it and gives you the iron, aluminum, manganese.
Intrigued, West Virginia scientists decided to look into things. This is when they were pleasantly surprised by the fact that every ton of the dry sludge that was formed by the process seems to hold about 2 pounds of rare earth metals. As you guys can imagine, this was massive, especially as it seemed to surpass overseas ore. This is despite the absence of drilling or other destructive activities that take place during mining. With nature doing most of the hard work, treatment plants went on to collect these rare metals. As such, it was an easy process for the scientists to refine them. With that in mind, we can see how the U.S. was experiencing how a polluted creek unexpectedly became one of the most valuable assets on the shores of the U.S., the reformed American resources. Following the events, the Richard mine site located close to Morgantown, West Virginia, was on site to witness as one of the most polluted sources of water in the country suddenly became the perfect spot for testing and research. Instead of treating mine drainage as toxic waste, they wondered what would happen if it was treated as ore. In order to achieve this, the scientists decided to approach this with 2 chemical steps. The first step was that they raised the pH levels to about 4.5. As a result, we found that iron and aluminum dropped to a certain level. That said, they found that the rare earths remained dissolved. Following this, we found that the second stage involved pushing the pH levels to about 8.5. As a result, the scientist found that the rare earth metals finally popped out of the solution. This created a dense metallic sludge that was pumped out by the plant into long white tubes that fed geoexile bags. Here, the water would be slowly drained away so that we could find something that was truly outstanding: a compact shipped concentrate of rare earth metals. This is fantastic, especially when we consider how we find ourselves in a world ruled by supply chains and geopolitics. This was great for the U.S. because this was the first easily accessible rare earth resource for many decades. As amazing as this was, extracting the metals was just the tip of the iceberg. Converting this sludge to something that scientists and manufacturers could use requires a new source of ingenuity and refinery. From sludge to weapon. Within the realm of the National Research Center for Coal and Energy, the engineers built a pilot plant that was much unlike anything that we had ever seen in the U.S. before. Thanks to the machines that worked 24/7 hours, they approached their mission of turning river sludge to high-purity, rare earth oxides. The first step in this process involved dissolving the dried sludge into acid. The next step involved separating the metals with the use of solvent extraction. The third step involves isolating each rare element, at least until one pure oxide powder remains. Once these processes were completed, the scientists found that they had achieved success, so much so that the earth concentrates extracted achieved 98% purity. This proved to be a resounding success, as this meant that, for the first time in modern history, the U.S. had developed a way to extract rare earths from its own waste streams. Phenomenal! The most amazing part of this achievement is that this was the best time for this to happen, especially as another force across the pond was making its bid to grasp global power for itself: the glaring eyes of China. For some time, the U.S. closed its mines because it believed that rare earths will always be available to them. Although they outsourced the entire supply chain, they found that China didn't do that. Instead, they kept their minds open and went to work. So much so that as we speak, China controls 70% of the world's rare earth ore. They 11 produce 90% of the magnets that power electric vehicles, missiles, fighter jets, wind turbines, and so on. Recently, China started using it to exert control on exports. This was so that the world would know that they controlled much of the metal that is needed on the planet. Although several countries all over the world were anxious due to this development, the U.S. could remain calm about things as they still had the tainted waters of West Virginia, among others, to rely on. With these bodies of water in place, there was nothing to fear for the people of the U.S. Indeed, the rare earth could prove to be the factor that determines the tide of global power in the years to come. As time goes on, maybe Decker Creek could prove to be the body of water that changed the world we know forever.